Week 5 is officially here, and today I got you guys covered with my top 40 wide receivers. I bring you guys in the tier list format every single week. We go tier by tier, we break down the wide receiver position, but before we get into it, we go through the will they play tier, and there's only one guy that would have made my top 40 if he was fully healthy going into this week, and that would have been Calvin Ridley, wide receiver of the Tennessee Titans. You guys see this tweet from Deepak, but his status is to be determined in week 5. He's listed as questionable for this game, and the data actually slightly favors him sitting. On top of that, if he does play in this game, Deepak does project a big dip in his production. So with Calvin Ridley, if you have him on your roster, sit him on the bench this week, even if he does suit up. And in addition to Calvin Ridley not being available for this game, we also have 4 teams on bye week this week. The Atlanta Falcons, the Chicago Bears, the Green Bay Packers, and the Pittsburgh Steelers, all having one or multiple wide receivers that would have figured their way into the top 40. I'm sure if you have Drake London, Rome Odunze, DK Metcalf, Matthew Golden, guys like that, you already know you will be without them, but just have to mention it to people off the top, hence why this top 40 list might look a little murkier than usual weeks. But now let's waste no more time, and let's go on to tier number 1, the top 2. This is what I classified this as. Puka Nacua, we saw play on Thursday Night Football. I'll talk about in a second. And, of course, Amon-Ra St. Brown going up against the Cincinnati Bengals this week. We'll start with Puka. Obviously, he ended up being my wide receiver 1. He is the wide receiver 1 in fantasy. You guys see on the screen 26.8 PPR points per game for Puka so far. He is a juggernaut. He is an alpha. We saw him on Thursday. 12 targets, 10 receptions, 85 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. When it comes to Puka Nacua, man, he looks like he's having his 2021 Cooper Kupp season, and he almost feels at this point like a lock on a week-to-week basis for 10-plus targets and 70-plus receiving yards. He is the one true set-it-and-forget-it elite wide receiver at this point, but the one closest is Amon-Ra St. Brown. You guys see as well, 23.6 points per game for Amon-Ra. And at this current point, he is the only wide receiver that can contest Puka Nacua on a week-to-week basis. With Amon-Ra St. Brown, he is one of only 2 wide receivers along with Puka to average over 20 points per game. And until CeeDee Lamb comes back and potentially makes it a 3-man tier, to me, like I said, these are the clear top 2 wide receivers in fantasy. No other wide receiver is averaging over 20 per game. And we got these guys having legit league-winning type of seasons. So with Amon-Ra going up against Cincy, as we know, their defense can't cover a nosebleed. Amon-Ra St. Brown, he is the alpha of this team, and I expect that to continue this week for Detroit. But now let's go on to tier number 2 and what I classify as the strong wide receiver 1s tier. We got wide receivers 3 to 7 in my rankings. Jackson Smith-Njigba, Nico Collins, George Pickens, Garrett Wilson, and Justin Jefferson are my 3 through 7 this week. We'll start off at the top here with Jackson Smith-Njigba, 17.83 PPR points per game this season. And him and Puka Nacua are the only 2 wide receivers in the NFL with over 4 yards per route run. The Bucs, they are a clear pass funnel defense, and JSN's year 3 ascension is clearly here. Over 70 receiving yards in each game this season, and he's automatic. Hopefully he doesn't get all of his production in the 4th like he did last week, but when it comes to JSN, he's rock solid. He's a mid to high end wide receiver 1. I have no concerns when it comes to JSN this week. Wide receiver 4 for me is Nico Collins of the Houston Texans going to play the Baltimore Ravens on the road. And with Nico Collins, it's kind of been, an up and down start to the year. He's the wide receiver 22 in fantasy, 13.5 points per game. But this feels like the breakthrough spot for Nico Collins. Baltimore secondary, they have gotten torched to start the season. And the Texans will more likely than not have the game script that they had last week against the Titans. We saw against the Titans not able to do anything on the other end. This is a closely projected game. As you guys can see, Houston is a 2-point favorite on the screen. So with Nico Collins, 27% of the team targets, 50% of the team air yards. We just needed him to connect on that 80-plus yard touchdown like the 6'4 freak Nico Collins is capable of. At wide receiver 5, we have George Pickens of my Dallas Cowboys going to play the New York Jets this week. Cowboys 2.5-point favorites on the road. And with George Pickens, I understand on surface level, you'll look at it, okay, potential shadow matchup. We know what Sauce Gardner is on the other side. Obviously, the archetype of wide receiver George Pickens is the archetype of wide receiver that Sauce Gardner usually shadows. However, the Jets are currently the 3rd worst team in defensive EPA per play against the pass, and George Pickens has commanded 9+ targets in his last 3 games as a Dallas Cowboy. As we know, no CeeDee Lamb in this game. Dak's playing at an unbelievable level, and George Pickens just scored over 30 PPR points in an objectively bad matchup against Green Bay. We're looking at this situation. If we know Dak inherently on a week-to-week basis will have to throw the ball 40-plus times, we know how bad the Cowboys defense is. George Pickens has to be viewed as a high-end wide receiver 1, at least until CeeDee Lamb is back on the field. So for the meantime, he's going to be my wide receiver 5. I love this game script, and don't be shocked if he equates to what he did last week. And on the flip side of that matchup, we have Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets going up against my Cowboys defense. Spoiler alert, I'm not delusional. I understand this is arguably the worst defense in the NFL. And this week, he's got the advantage both in the matchup as well as the game environment this week. That's another thing about this Cowboys-Jets game. This game has the 4th highest over-under of the slate and the fastest pace game of the slate. So when we're looking at this situation, Justin Fields, this Jets offense, they are going to have to match blow for blow with the Cowboys offense. And I do think we see Justin Fields air the ball out more than normal. So with Garrett Wilson, if we see 30-plus Fields pass attempts in this game, he's got wide receiver 1 overall in the range of outcomes. And then finally, rounding this tier, we have Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings. Kind of ironic, as we know in the Flock League, Corey took Garrett Wilson over Justin Jefferson, and I think that's how it should be ranked going into week 5. However, I really do love Justin Jefferson this week. 15.25 PPR points per game this year. Unlike Nico Collins, the reason why I'm ranking him this high is I'm trusting the player to have his "this is why I'm elite" type of moment. And don't get me wrong, last week was a solid game for Justin Jefferson, but the Browns are a pass funnel defense, and Jefferson is coming off his best game of the season. Now we go into another start with Carson Wentz. We saw 46 pass attempts last week. I think we continue to see the Vikings throw the football with Jordan Addison back on the field, and Justin Jefferson to be this team's 38% target share alpha. But moving on to my third tier going into week 5, we have Emeka Egbuka at number 8, Devontae Adams at number 9, Xavier Worthy at number 10, Teteroa McMillan at number 11. We have Quentin Johnson making his debut in the top 12 at 12. And then we have Jamar Chase at 13. And yes, I will explain myself. If you had told me coming into this season that I would have a graphic ranking Quentin Johnson over Jamar Chase in a week of fantasy, I wouldn't believe you, but we'll talk about that at the end of this tier. We'll start off at the top with Emeka Egbuka of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He comes in at an 8, and I think you have to be bullish on Egbuka moving forward. The way he's played to start his career, 17.8 PPR points per game. For reference, 17.8 points per game is actually more than Amon St. Brown had his entire second year. Second year of Amon St. Brown, wide receiver 7 in fantasy, Emeka Egbuka is currently outproducing that. And with Emeka Egbuka, I think this breakout is absolutely real. And with no Mike Evans on the field yet again, I think he is this team's wide receiver 1, at least until we see Chris Godwin play a little bit better. Regardless, though, with Egbuka, you have to trust a young talent playing as well as he has. 3 touchdowns in 4 games, as well as 2 straight games of over 80-plus receiving yards. With Egbuka, the Seattle defense is also banged up in this game, so I trust him with wide receiver 1 level confidence. Again, he's not quite in that top 7 tier, but I do think he is the head of this next tier. My next low-end wide receiver 1 at 9 actually played on Thursday Night Football. Devontae Adams, 13.8 PPR points on 11 targets, and again, solid day, 13.8 you will take in your lineup. Again, maybe you're hoping for a little bit better. Maybe he would have scored a touchdown like he did in the previous weeks. Maybe you would have expected a little bit if you heard 11 targets going into the night, but regardless, 13.8, you can never complain. You're getting that consistent involvement, and Devontae Adams, despite being the 2 on his team, is getting wide receiver 1 volume moving forward. I view him as a top 12 level guy. And at number 10, we have Xavier Worthy of the Kansas City Chiefs going up on Monday Night Football against the Jacksonville Jaguars. And with Xavier Worthy in his, I would classify this as his season debut. Yes, technically, he played in week 1. He played on that first drive, but we knew what Travis Kelce did taking off his shoulder. Xavier Worthy returned to full health in week 4, and we saw him contribute in a big way. Only 71% of the routes, but on those routes, he had 8 targets and led this team in receiving. 27% target rate and a 24% target share in that game last week. And going into this week, maybe we see the routes go up. Only 71% like I said last week. If Xavier Worthy's fully healthy, full week of practice like he's gotten, maybe we see him get back to that 80, 85, possibly 90+% route share player. And on top of that, Mahomes is throwing the ball extremely well, and Xavier Worthy was a big needed part of this offense. And he's a clear top 10 to 15 option until Rashee Rice is back on the field. Next up at wide receiver 11, we have Teteroa McMillan going up against the Miami Dolphins. And this is one of the biggest positive regression candidates in fantasy football right now. What he is doing as a rookie wide receiver is phenomenal. It just hasn't exactly equated in the box score yet because he's the wide receiver 33 in overall production, but he has a 28% yearly target share and a 41% share of the team's air yards. With Miami, they have the second worst defense against the pass in the league, only ahead of the Dallas Cowboys, and we saw exactly what Garrett Wilson and Justin Fields were able to do to them on Monday Night Football. The usage is too good, and we trust a huge game environment for Tedero and McMillan. I think this is the breakout spot, and I think we see 100 plus yards and a touchdown. That is why I am taking the higher on his 64.5 receiving yards over on Underdog. And at 12, welcome Quentin Johnson. It is time I give you my flowers. You have come out the first month of the season and have been a legitimate league winner in fantasy football. And it hasn't been fluky, man. He's gotten elite volume, and it's just simple as him performing like one of the best receivers in the league. So I'm going to rank him as such, man. You're going to keep playing this well. You're going to be a wide receiver 1 in fantasy. I will rank you like a wide receiver 1 in fantasy. It's very clear at this point, at least for now, that Quentin Johnson is the number 1 wide receiver for the LA Chargers, and he has the best big play upside of this core. And when you combine that with the fact that Washington sucks against the pass and the Chargers are number 1 in pass rate over expectation to begin with, we could be talking about 45 plus Herbert pass attempts and Quentin Johnson to absolutely spike in your lineup yet again. Coming after Quentin Johnson, we're a month into the year, and I'm talking about wide receiver 13, Jamar Chase. He's going up against Detroit, and that might just be the saving grace for Jamar Chase this week. Detroit, they are an extreme pass funnel defense. Number 2 against the run this year, about middle of the pack against the pass. And with Jamar Chase, this Lions secondary is not Minnesota, is not Denver. So yes, it feels like the sky's falling. It feels like Jamar Chase, oh my God, he's going to end up being a bust. Jake Browning can't do anything through the air. Let's at least see what Browning looks like in a better matchup. Because with Jamar Chase, he's only had 2 finishes in the top 30 wide receivers in the 9 starts that Jake Browning has made in his career. But I can't overlook one of the best wide receivers in football in a much easier comparative matchup. The Detroit secondary is banged up, and Jamar Chase is simply too good to be this bad on a week-to-week basis. I'm going to trust him again, and we are hoping that the passing volume can get Chase back up to that level. But moving on to the strong wide receiver 2s tier, we have wide receivers 14 through 19, Deebo Samuel, Michael Pittman, Courtland Sutton, Marvin Harrison, Jacoby Myers, and Chris Olave in my rankings this week. Starting with wide receiver 14, Deebo Samuel going on the road to play the LA Chargers. And there is some concern here. He missed 2 practices this week with a heel injury, but he practiced in full on Friday, and he is cleared to play. And as we see from Deepak, he projects a mild dip in production going into week 5 this week. And to be honest, I'm just bullish of the fact that he is the number 1 wide receiver with Jaden Daniels coming back and no Terry McLaurin in the lineup. I think with Deebo Samuel, he has significant upside because with Deebo, while he may get less design rushes in the context of this offense, he scored 15 plus points in 3 of his 4 games this year. And like I said with Jaden Daniels, having him back is a big plus for this offense. They didn't have his creation ability in these last couple of weeks with Marcus Mariota starting. With Jaden Daniels back, we know his reputation as creator, and we know Deebo Samuel's propensity to get the big play. Similar case with Michael Pittman Jr. Like Deebo, he's been dealing with his own injury this week with the hamstring, but Deepak doesn't seem to be concerned at all for that hamstring injury. Does sound like Michael Pittman will be at full health, and he's currently the wide receiver 14 in fantasy with no Alec Pierce in the lineup this week. We saw it with the Colts last week without Pierce. They hyper-fixated their passing game on Michael Pittman Jr. And in this matchup, the Colts are implied for nearly 28 points and are the 3rd highest projected offense of the week. Because of that, the market clearly likes the Colts offense to score a lot of points. So I will be taking Michael Pittman higher than 0.5 rushing plus receiving touchdowns this week. He scored a touchdown in 3 of his 4 games this season, and I think he does it again in this game environment. Wide receiver 16, we have Courtland Sutton of the Denver Broncos going up against the Philadelphia Eagles. And on face value, this feels a bit low for Courtland Sutton. Like, he's been great to start the season. He's clearly the number 1 wide receiver on this team. Like, I will give him his flowers, but this is me paying my respect to the Eagles secondary because with Courtland Sutton, he's the exact archetype of wide receiver that Quinyon Mitchell will typically shadow, and the Eagles are the 6th best defense in EPA against the pass this year. And while Sutton will still remain a strong play given the touchdown equity and target volume he has in this offense, I actually do like the lower on his receiving yards. Like I said, very tough matchup against Philly. Quinyon Mitchell will be on it for the majority of this game. So give me the lower on his receiving yards at 56.5 this week. At wide receiver 17, we have Marvin Harrison Jr. of the Arizona Cardinals going up against the Tennessee Titans. And I understand on surface level, you'll look at the production, you'll look at the peripherals. And with Marvin Harrison Jr., this seems very aggressive. Like wide receiver 17, I will acknowledge is a very aggressive ranking on Marv, but I really do think the light switch for him. We saw after that touchdown, the amount of stress, the amount of overall mental burden was lifted off of Marvin Harrison Jr., and he stopped overthinking and he started playing football. We know with Marv, number 2 overall pick, generational wide receiver prospect. We have talked about that in abundance in the last couple of years. The thing with Marv, though, you can really tell the struggles that he had on the field really impacted his mental. So I do hope that that touchdown, the level of play he had at the end of last week's game, will be indicative of the Marv we get rest of the season. Because if that Marv is the Marv we see every single week going forward, we're talking about a potential top 15 wide receiver rest away. Again, I'm optimistic. I'll have him at 17, but this is one to watch because if we see Marvin Harrison Jr. revert back to the Marv we saw in about the first 20 games of his career, this is going to be overranked. Receiver 18, we have Jacoby Myers of the Las Vegas Raiders going up against the Indianapolis Colts, and the Colts secondary has a ton of question marks going into this game. Xavier Howard, he retires midweek, and Kenny Moore was already ruled out for this game. With Brock Bowers banged up entering this with a knee injury, I think we see Jacoby Myers trusted as the clear number 1 target for Geno Smith in this game. And Geno Smith, he has been mistake prone, but we know he's capable of playing good football like he showed in week 3. So really when it comes down to it with Jacoby Myers, you're getting 7+ targets in 3 or 4 games. And to me, this is the bounce back spot for this Raiders offense this week. At wide receiver 19, we have Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints going up against the New York Giants. And Chris Olave is tied for second in the NFL with 43 targets in this season and 10+ targets in 3 of his 4 games played this year. The only issue with Chris Olave is that the big plays really haven't been there, and he has low touchdown equity in a bad New Orleans offense. 4.3 yards per target is something that we usually see from a running back. Like, for example, we make our jokes about Wan'Dale Robinson last year. Wan'Dale Robinson 2024 converting 143 targets into less than 700 receiving yards. And Chris Olave currently has a lower yards per target. So with Chris Olave, we're going to need to see some more big plays. We're going to need to see some more touchdown equity for Olave to fully crush. But even despite the low ADOT, we're talking about a guy that's currently a top 25 wide receiver in fantasy. And this is one of the few games all year that New Orleans will be favored and have a high implied total at 22. So let's hope we can see the big plays mixed in and potentially a touchdown or 2 for Olave this week. Moving on to the back end wide receiver 2s tier. We have wide receivers 20 through 25 in my rankings. Jalen Waddle, A.J. Brown, Zay Flowers, Brian Thomas Jr., Keenan Allen, and Ladd McConkey this week. And with Jalen Waddle, he is clearly the big riser following the injury to Tyreek Hill. But I'd say there is still a bit of risk. Carolina, they are a run funnel defense, and they have a clear number 1 corner with J.C. Horn on the outside. I do think that the roll-up tick and the overall big play upside of Waddle is good enough to overcome it. However, I do think there's risk. J.C. Horn is no slouch on the outside, and instead of ranking Waddle like a set it and forget it top 15, top 18 guy, I want to at least see how he suffices in that wide receiver 1 role, and who knows, maybe we see more Devon Achane, maybe we see more, Darren Waller, Malik Washington's look good. I just am hesitant to fully rank Waddle inside of my top 18 guys this week. At wide receiver 21, we have A.J. Brown of the Philadelphia Eagles, and he is the hardest player in fantasy to rank right now because, on one hand, he's an elite real-life player, he's still commanding an alpha-level volume, and he has a 29% target share and a 45% air yard share for the Eagles this year. The peripherals are great. The problem is that we have seen under 25 Philadelphia passing attempts in 3 of their 4 games this year, and the defense just simply have been able to keep them in these methodical, low-pace type of game scripts we've seen from the Philadelphia offense, and that is a big issue, man. On top of that, we know what the Broncos defense represents on the other end. We know Pat Surtain is a dog on the other side, so 21's where I ended up having him because, on one hand, 8+ targets, you're banking on an elite player to eventually pay off, but I just don't know if it happens this week. A wide receiver 22 for me is Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens going to play the Houston Texans. And Zay Flowers is the wide receiver 17 in fantasy, and he's taken his volume share to the next level on this Ravens offense. 29% of the yearly targets and 3 games with over a 25+% target share for Lamar Jackson this year. But the elephant in the room is that there is no Lamar Jackson. We have Cooper Rush making his start this week. And I'll just say I'm a bit concerned when it comes to the Ravens offense. Like, you're going from a situation where the Ravens are going to be implied for 27, 28, 29 points in this game. Now with Cooper Rush, we're at less than 20 implied points. And don't get me wrong, Flowers' usage, it is still excellent, so I trust him. But Cooper Rush's floor is extremely low in this game environment. At wide receiver 23, we have Brian Thomas Jr. of the Jacksonville Jaguars going to play the Kansas City Chiefs this week. And he's objectively played bad, but the theme of this tier is trusting underperforming wide receivers in fantasy to be able to get back on track. Because with BTJ, despite him playing awful, he is still a top 15 wide receiver in usage. And the Jaguars have had 30-plus pass attempts in every single game this year. 40-plus pass attempts in 2 of their 4 games. It's clear as day that the Jaguars want to throw the football. And like I mentioned with Xavier Worthy on the other end, the Chiefs should be able to put up points in this game. Hunter, he's still a part-time player. De'Ami Brown, he's still banged up. We are trusting BTJ with wide receiver 2 expectation, given the dominance he has over this team's share. If he goes out there and he has his big game, we're talking about a big-time ascension going into the rankings next week. And then wide receivers 24 and 25, we will group together with Keenan Allen and Ladd McConkey, obviously both of the LA Chargers. I talked about it with QJ. QJ needs to be treated like the wide receiver 1 on this team, at least for the time being. But I think this is a potential get-right spot specifically for Ladd McConkey, because with Ladd McConkey, despite Mike saying we're still getting cleared for this game, he missed practice this week with a knee injury, and as we know with Ladd McConkey, he gets the majority of his usage out of the slot, like Keenan Allen, except Ladd McConkey plays over 90% of the Chargers snaps, and Keenan Allen's been under 80% of the snaps in each game this season. So I'm going to rank Allen higher for the time being. He has played better than Ladd McConkey. I do think at this point, given the fact he's the wide receiver 10 and Ladd McConkey's in the 50s, I can't reasonably rank Ladd McConkey above him. But don't get me wrong, if we're talking about the narrative after this week being why didn't we buy low on Ladd McConkey, I wouldn't be shocked. Because he's still the same talent we saw dominate down the stretch last year. They just need to figure out a few things in the offense right now. But moving on to the high-end wide receiver 3s. These are the wide receivers 26 through 30 in my rankings. We have Jameson Williams, Stephon Diggs, Chris Godwin, Jordan Addison, and Wan'Dale Robinson there this week. Jameson Williams starts off at the top here. It's pretty simple, man. We saw 8 targets from Jameson Williams in week 4 after only 13 combined targets in weeks 1 to 3. With Jameson Williams, you get the elite game environment, you get the elite matchup against Cincinnati, and he feels due for that week 2 type of performance we saw against Chicago. His range of outcomes, it's going to be up and down every single week. Like, we know when Jameson is on, he has the upside to be a top 3 wide receiver in fantasy, but like we've seen, the floor just simply hasn't been there. But in this game environment, I think the Lions might score 40 to 45 plus points, and if we can see the type of consistent involvement like we did last week, Jameson Williams is going to have a huge ceiling. 27, we got Stephon Diggs of the New England Patriots. And the Patriots finally took the training wheels off of Stephon Diggs this past week. 82% of the routes and 41% of the targets for this Patriots offense. They trusted him as Drake May's clear number 1 wide receiver, and he delivered back in a big way. It looks like I said, they ramped him up. Older player coming off of an ACL tear. He didn't look like himself in the first few weeks, but he looked like Stephon Diggs in week 4, and I trust that moving forward. Drake May, he looks fantastic. And this offense is in desperate need for Stephon Diggs to be the alpha. So that is why I am trusting him to go higher than 8.85 fantasy points. I think he's going to play, again, 80+% of the routes, potentially 90+% of the routes this week. And he is going to get peppered by Drake May in this matchup. A wide receiver 28, Chris Godwin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And I'm a little bit concerned that the efficiency was so bad last week, but 10 targets is 10 targets, and we should expect a ramp up in his second week active this year. There's no Mike Evans in this game, and Baker Mayfield, this is a type of quarterback that can support both of these wide receivers in the offense. And again, I can't rank him much higher than this until we see the efficiency return for Chris Godwin. But I'm optimistic. Like, as soon as we see it, we know Tampa Bay is going to throw the ball 35 plus times a game. And Chris Godwin, we saw be a legitimate high-end wide receiver 1 last year. I don't think he's going to be a wide receiver 1 this year, but can he get back to wide receiver 2, top 15, top 18 area next to Emeka Egbuka? I absolutely think so. And next up at 29, we got Jordan Addison going to play the Cleveland Browns this week. And his first game looked great. 8 targets, 114 receiving yards. And as we know, he did get hawked down from behind on a big-time potential touchdown by Peyton Wilson. With Cleveland, like I mentioned with Justin Jefferson, they are a pass funnel defense. You could not run the football against the Cleveland Browns. You can throw it against them a little bit, and we just saw Carson Wentz with 46 passes last week. Jefferson will eat, but I think there's enough room on the table for Jordan Addison to get his licks in as well. And then the final name of this tier, we got Wan'Dale Robinson of the New York Giants going to play New Orleans. Pretty simple. He takes over as the #1 wide receiver for the Giants with no Malik Neighbors in the lineup this week. And with Wan'Dale Robinson, like, you're hoping he kind of gets there the Olave way. We saw with Chris Olave, I mentioned 43 targets, only 4.3 yards per target. I'm not toting Wan'Dale Robinson because I think he's going to take, 3 targets for 96 yards and 3 touchdowns. Like, that's not what I'm saying. He's not Marquez Valdes-Scantling. The way that Wan'Dale Robinson will need to pay off is like a 10, 11, 12 target game, and maybe we see some of the big plays that we saw against the Dallas Cowboys in week 2. Jackson Dart, he looked good last week. Maybe we see more potential passing volume in his second ever start, and I really do like this matchup going up against New Orleans this week. But we'll be quicker through wide receivers 31 through 40. We'll start off with the back-end wide receiver 3s, aka wide receivers 31 through 35 in my rankings this week. Devontae Smith, T. Higgins, Khalil Shakir, Io Manor, and Jerry Jeudy consist of this tier. And we'll start off with Devontae Smith going against Denver. I mentioned how bad the matchup is when I talked about A.J. Brown, and you're not even getting that 29% target share like you are with A.J. Brown. 23%, again, very solid, but at the same time, when this offense is only throwing the ball 22 times, 24 times, 21 times, it's hard to see both these guys be consistent on a week-to-week basis, and that's kind of what's materialized throughout this season. I'm higher on A.J. Brown this week, but I think both are very volatile given the current volume. We know their talent is there. We just simply need Philadelphia to throw the football, and especially when it comes to red zone opportunities. At 32, we got T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals. He's been bad. Jake Browning has struggled, but the last 2 games have come against the #1 and #7 defense in EPA per play. Minnesota's defense, they are absolutely no joke. Denver's defense, they are absolutely no joke. This Detroit secondary, you can throw on them. On top of that, this is a big-time pass funnel. Detroit's defense very good against the run, susceptible against the pass. But I do have some concerns here because with T. Higgins, he just simply also hasn't played well. He's been under 40 yards in 3 of his 4 games and under 60 in each game this year. So with T. Higgins, we're hoping the matchup can make Jake Browning play better, but we also need Higgins himself to play better. And at wide receiver 33, we got Khalil Shakir of the Buffalo Bills going up against the New England Patriots. He's gotten 40-plus yards and a touchdown in back-to-back weeks, and he should be able to avoid a lot of Christian Gonzalez in this game. He plays the slot. Obviously, we know Christian Gonzalez, most of his damage coming on outside snaps. And with Khalil Shakir, the risk is just how dominant the Bills' run game is in the red zone. But with the Bills, they are a top 2 implied offense this week, and Khalil Shakir is averaging 12 points per game this season. There is risk. He's had 2 games of under 80% of the routes, but he's the premier yak threat in this Bills offense. But moving on to wide receiver 34, we have Io Manor of the Tennessee Titans going up against Arizona. And like I mentioned up the top with the will they play tier, Calvin Ridley was the only name on that list, and he is either going to be out or have a major dip in his production this week according to Deepak. And with Io Manor, he has gotten 5+ targets in each game this season. The offense, sure, it is a very rough projection. But without Calvin Ridley, Io Manor has 10 target upside in this matchup, and he is currently already a top 40 wide receiver in fantasy this year. Now, wide receiver 35, we have Jerry Jeudy of the Cleveland Browns going up against Minnesota. Another example of a wide receiver that's gotten the usage, but simply has not performed well this season. He's currently the wide receiver 56 in PPR points per game, and he's playing for a bad offense in a bad matchup against Minnesota. Like I mentioned with Minnesota, #1 in defensive EPA per play against the pass, but I'd still be willing to put Jeudy in my lineup, especially in bye week season, because he's gotten 8+ targets in 3 of 4 games, and we could potentially see a jump in offensive efficiency with Dylan Gabriel taking over as quarterback. And we need him to play closer to the weeks 1 to 2 Jeudy in order for him to pay off. But with Dylan Gabriel, we could see a rookie quarterback hyper-fixate on his wide receiver 1. I wouldn't be shocked if Jerry Jeudy got targeted even 12 times in this game. Now going rapid fire through these last 5 guys, Troy Franklin at 36. It is a terrible matchup, but he's still the wide receiver 2 in Denver in terms of usage. Mims, he had his big week last week, but only on 40% of the snaps. With Troy Franklin, you have games of 8 and 9 targets, so I am trusting him as the #2 on this team. Don't like the matchup, but I do like the potential volume we could see. We got Darius Slayton going up against the New Orleans Saints, and I mentioned that Wan'Dale Robinson is my preference as the #1 on this team, but we did see Slayton really thrive in the lineup without Neighbors last season. He's the X on this team. He's got the big play upside. While I think Wan'Dale Robinson will lead the team in targets, I think Darius Slayton will lead the team in air yards this week, and I think both are viable options in this matchup. Wide receiver 38 is Josh Downs going up against Las Vegas, and he's a guy that I entered the season extremely high on, But the problem for Josh Downs has been the lack of snaps, because Downs hasn't played a single game this season with over 80% of the Colts routes, which is a cause for concern in my opinion. However, we saw AD Mitchell make a ton of boneheaded plays last week. We obviously know Alec Pierce is out, and who knows, maybe the coaching staff, they say, hey, AD, you're not ready yet. You're not seasoned yet to be in 2 wide receiver sets. We're going to put Josh Downs into the lineup. We've gotten Shane Steichen uncommittal as to whether or not AD Mitchell will play in this game. And if that's the case and he's not playing in 2 wide receiver sets, that is a huge boon for Josh Downs. If we can get Josh Downs up to an 80+% route share, we are feeling good about his involvement in this offense. He just simply hasn't been on the field enough. Wide receiver 39, Marquise Brown of the Chiefs going up against Jacksonville. And while he hasn't gotten that usage we saw in week 1, he has gotten 5+ targets in every single game this year. He did see his snaps cut to 60% of the snaps in week 4. But the passing volume is the reason why I'm still willing to take the upside shot on Hollywood during bye week season. 35+ pass attempts in 3 of 4 games this year. And I think we see the Chiefs continue to emphasize the passing game as they get more and more healthy. And then closing off this list at wide receiver 40, we have Keon Coleman of the Buffalo Bills. He's plateaued after that dominant week 1 that we saw. But in a week full of buys, he's still an upside shot, in my opinion, worth putting into your lineup. Because with Keon Coleman, we've seen the touchdowns the last few weeks go the way of Khalil Shakir, go the way of Dalton Kincaid. But Keon Coleman has weekly touchdown equity in this offense. We know his size. We know his ability at the catch point. And while he is volatile, we are chasing touchdowns with Coleman this week. But if you guys enjoyed, make sure you leave a like down below. And I mentioned my pick'em entry for this week. Funny enough, the last 2 pick'em entries we've done in week 3 and week 4 actually have both hit in the lineup. So you take the picks that I talked about today: Michael Pittman, Cortland Sutton, Teteroy McMillan, Stephon Diggs. You put them all together, you add the 30% profit boost, and use code FSE at sign up and first deposit over on Underdog. Get up to $1,000 in bonus funds, as well as a free gimme pick over on the site. Again, tailor-fade my picks, promo code FSE. Appreciate you guys for making it this far. But with that being said, peace out. We'll talk to you soon. Good luck in week 5. Let's secure those W's.